Hello, everybody. Welcome to the very first hosted OpsWatt Academy webinar, where we talk to industry professionals about the latest cybersecurity topics and trends. I'm Nate Medeiros, part of the OpsWatt Academy team, the product owner of technical certifications. And over here is Irfan Shakil, the VP of Training and Certifications. Irfan, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, this is Irfan. As Nate said, that I'm the VP of Training and Certification Services at Opsword, and I'm responsible to deliver all the robust critical infrastructure protection, cybersecurity training, and other resources such as this webinar. And there are tons of other resources. You should check out opswordacademy.com. Over to you, Nate.
Got it. Thanks, Irfan. At the OpsWatt Academy, we have a wide range of students, from people just learning about cybersecurity to people that have been in the industry for a long time. With us today, we have our guest speaker and our expert of the day for this session, talking about security by design and application security, George Prikic, the VP of Products. George, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Nate. As Nate mentioned, I'm George Prikic. I'm the VP of Products on the application security side. I've been with OPSAT for almost 8.5 years now. I'm heavily focused on different, let's say, products and more focused on application security, and especially when it comes to the topic today, how we can actually secure your applications, how you can introduce security as part of your development workflow, and so on.
Thanks, George. And a little bit of background as to why this particular topic is so relevant now. The Biden administration recently released a national cybersecurity strategy at the beginning of March. And we're going to be asking George some questions that are pretty relevant to that as a general scope when it comes to critical infrastructure protection in the terms of cybersecurity, and what are some things that we can expect moving forward. So I'm going to kick it off here with the first question, but so everybody in the audience knows, feel free to ask questions in the chat. This is a live interview. We have George here and are using his time to get his expertise on the subject. So feel free to add questions in chat. And if we have time, we'll bring them up and talk about them at any point. So I'll kick it off here for George and jump right into application security. So, from a developer standpoint, does the practice of creating products with security by design as a mindset inherently make the solutions more difficult to implement into customer environments?
Um, I think this is maybe like to take one step back, right? At the end of the day, everyone is trying. I think it depends a lot on the maturity of the product. Let's start there, right? So when we're looking at like a very early startup or an idea you're trying to build, right? It's great if you're actually able to like bring that security mindset right from the beginning. Usually, it doesn't happen that way, right? People are more focused on let's build a pilot, and being here in San Francisco and Silicon Valley has this mentality of being agile, lean development, and so on. And we're using these words in the wrong manner, most probably. It's more about like, let's move fast, figure out what works, what not, throw it away, and keep building on top of that one. And with that mindset is the entire idea, let's speed up the process. Let's try to bring as many things in as we can to move fast, meaning like tools, meaning also libraries and so on, right? For it to actually prove a point, to validate an idea. And that usually it's not actually going to a proper validation from security perspective, right? So it's more about like, how is this gonna potentially be a bottleneck for innovation for very early startups versus what happens this one for like a lot more mature products, right? Now, when you're looking at a product that's been on market for quite a few years, has the larger customer base, actually having this kind of like security practice in place, it's mandatory, right? But it's a matter of like where you actually introduce these ones and how you introduce them. Ideally, yes, we need to shift the mentality of being something that happens down the path to something that needs to happen early on, right? The way I like to see it is that maybe like, to simplify it, right? Like, we want engineers to code, right? We want developers to focus on code because that's what we're paying them for. But then we start building secondary, and pardon me for calling that way, secondary titles and secondary jobs like QA, because we don't want for them to spend time testing their code, and we have something way more specialized in building and writing unit tests and test cases and so on, right? Then we want someone else to build automation. We start looking more DevOps and so on, right? Because we want engineers just to focus on code, and then we bring application security engineers and so on. Now, when you're a smaller company, that you have to do everything, right? You like it or not, you're hands-on, you're going to touch all of that, and that's going to give you a lot of exposure. So if they're in, because I see a couple of students that are here that are trying to get maybe their first job as an, I don't know, cybersecurity engineer or an application security engineer or just a software engineer, think about this way. The amount of, I don't know, not just intelligence, the amount of broaden scope, let's call it, or the amount of different tasks you're going to do in a startup, you're never going to do in a more mature company, right? Because you like it or not, you're going to be exposed to some very, very different things on a daily basis, going to jump from one thing to another. I think that's going to be an amazing experience when you're at the beginning, because you need to understand what you want to do next, and then you're actually going to go and specialize in a certain field. Right. So getting back to the original question, sorry for the long intro. And maybe before we continue, I should mention that all my answers are going to be very long and it's going to be all over the place. But
That's why we have you here, George. That's why we have you here.
Thank
to
you,
do
Nate.
the brain dump.
Right. But the entire idea for me is like this, right? What other security measures you can put in place from the beginning versus what can actually come later on, right? You're not going to build a brand new product or a brand new company on the idea, first, I need to go and get 3 ISO certifications. I need to go and get, I don't know, SOC 2 if I want to build a SaaS product. I need to spend $1 million on certification and so on before I actually have a pilot. Nobody's going to be able to do that. That's definitely going to cripple your startup in your business model and business plan, right? Now, when it comes to like what was announced from the Biden-Harris administration, actually a couple of weeks ago, at the beginning of this month, the focus is actually that we need to actually have a more responsibility on the software developers, right? And I'm not talking just on the engineers, I'm talking actually about the companies that are producing that, right? And maybe as an easy and stupid example, I'm really good at those ones, is you have a car, you're driving 100 miles an hour on the highway, the airbag goes off. Who's responsible, right? Well, is the manufacturer if there's that kind of incident and actually end up killing people and so on. If you're hit going that car in a wall and the airbag goes off and still not saves your life, well, it's your fault that you're hitting that wall. But if someone's hacking that car and it's blowing up the airbag at 100 miles an hour, who's responsible for that, right? And I think that kind of like thinking end up in the current administration's guidelines where we should move forward, right? It shouldn't be just that, hey, you're buying a car, it's your own responsibility what you do with that car, you put in your environment, you're responsible how you manage that one. Well, if the car is not secure enough and you're actually allowing people to like easily get in, or you're allowing someone to actually run malicious things directly in that car, it shouldn't be your responsibility, right? It's the manufacturer that's supposed to be responsible for what they're building and what they're shipping to you, right?
Right.
And
The shared responsibility. And
Right.
with that, George, going on your point about focusing on code and creating applications that are specialized and ready to be placed in these environments, many of the nation's critical infrastructure systems are still operating on really dated technology. So, is there a waiting period that we as cybersecurity engineers have to adhere to before we can start putting these new idealized products in place, or is there going to have to be more leeway in the private sector and integrating with vulnerable and non-ideal environments?
And maybe before I answer that, let's clarify one thing when it comes to critical infrastructure, because we keep using the term critical infrastructure. I want to make sure that everyone is aware. The way the way we're looking at critical infrastructure is the way CISA is actually defined. There's 16 different verticals, and it's not just your ICS, your critical like industrial control systems, environments, SCADA, and so on, right? It's not just about, let's look at like, I know, energy, power plants, energy grid, water, wastewater, utilities. We're not looking just at, I don't know, it's everything. It's government, it's defense, it's financial, banking with financial services, it's technology, it's transportation, right?
Military, yeah.
yeah, there's 16 different verticals that are highly relevant for this topic, right? So think about any industry out there. If that industry goes out tomorrow, life as we know it is over, right? So if there's no more banking tomorrow, nobody can actually go and exercise anything. They cannot buy anything, and so on and so forth, right? So that's when we're talking about critical infrastructure. Now, looking back at that, there's a little bit more diverse when it comes to critical infrastructure and those verticals on how they approach or how risk adverse they are. Now, there are certain sectors like nuclear power plants and even energy and so on that are highly regulated, right? They have a lot less appetite to go and try a brand new product out of the shelf, something that was a 10 people startup that is like 1 year old, right?
A lot of those environments are fully disconnected too in the
Right.
networks.
And those are the ones that takes even like, I don't know, over a year to make a big change and so on. Now, when we're looking at these highly regulated, or not even highly regulated, but more mature environments, you need to look into like what actually makes sense for them, right? So whenever they're looking at, hey, I need a product, I'm going to deploy it in my environment. Well, there's a huge process there on what you're deploying. Going and get approval for like 5 different teams from your networking infrastructure and so on and so forth, provision all that and so on, config management, a small change and product update or product upgrade will take probably like even a month of bureaucracy and approvals and so on in certain environments. So keep that in mind when you're saying, hey, I need to go and update something. Hey, here's a new version, go and deploy it, everything is going to be fine. That actually is going to go a long way depending on the environments you're targeting. Now, for us as a consumer, I have my iPhone. I get maybe like a weekly updates and so on. Click, yeah, update now, we're good, right? That's not how this happens in these environments. And maybe like one of the best examples, even though it's quite a few years old now, I think WannaCry hit May 2016 or 2017, as far as I remember. A few months later, there was an article that U.S. Department of Defense extended had like some, I don't know, outrageous number. I'm not gonna say how much contract with Microsoft to extend
Let's say X
Windows
number.
XP,
Yeah.
Windows XP support for another 10 years, right? So that actually goes back to the original question, like how are they gonna respond to all these new threats and how they're gonna actually go and update their environments? And it's not that trivial, right? Now there are a lot of steps that have been taken in that direction, right? And the SaaS adoption, not only in banking and technology, but also in government, especially in US with FedRAMP and so on. It's went in that direction for them to manage as much as possible less, and for them to consume out of the box and highly maintained and secure products, right?
That's good, George. I have another question linked with that one. For example, in this newly published cybersecurity strategy, we can see that the few words such as security and resilience is like there are a lot of security and resilience mentioned in the document. So if I talk about the practical implications, so what are the practical similarities and differences between these two terms or phases?
Right. So there are quite a few, let's say, there are a few topics actually in that plan, in that national security strategy, right? Let's focus a little bit more on the application security side, not as much as on OT and cyber threat sharing and so on, right? Now, when we're building for security and resilience, right, it's very important. I think one of the key things there, and I go back to that part, is that they're going to make the software developers responsible. They're going to make actually the, product developers responsible. And right, and from that perspective, it's like, okay, how we can ensure that these people are actually going to have a secure development lifecycle, how we can ensure the products they're building are resilient to external threats as well, right? And I think that mindset is so important because this is something that's not so easy to enforce, right? And
Right.
maybe
Because that goes for everything, right? That goes for the external email systems. That goes for the OT systems within. Anything that the private sector is delivering to this government facility is it going
and
to
it's
have to
not
adhere
just
to the responsibility.
Right, and it's not just the private sector. That's the interesting part, right? Like this will apply also not just to commercial out-the-shelf solution. It will apply also for custom-built solution for them, right? So that mindset actually needs to go way beyond that. Like, hey, I need to build something that's gonna last for years instead of like a short-term project. I'm gonna throw over the fence. They're gonna run it. I don't care anymore, and so on, right? So that part is, I think, so important. Now, when we're looking at what actually they're trying to do, and I think this is the part I appreciate. They want to open this on a public-private, not necessarily debate, but collaboration more, right? Like how we can actually define those guidelines that we can actually go and enforce. Because there are a lot of guidelines right now, and again, I'm very good at giving like stupid examples, so I'll give another one. Like VPAT, right? There's the Accessibility Act in US, and same thing applies worldwide with the web accessibility guidelines and so on, right? At the end of the day, this needs to be followed by everyone. Not everyone is enforcing it, right? The fact exists there doesn't mean it's enforced. There was actually 2 years ago was the executive order. Government needs to actually document all the products they have, to have an SBOM from all of them and so on. And that created an explosion of supply chain security market and whoever is out there to like generate SBOMs and so on. They're not necessarily still enforcing it, right? So it's a matter like how they can actually adopt all that. Now, you can go extra miles. You can actually go through different certification programs to make sure you're documenting and you actually you have a secure development life cycle, right? And you can document, you can run, let's say, based on NIST guidelines and so on, or you can have a different guideline. You can actually go and get even part of common criteria, some validation on that one, ISO and so on. But this goes back to like, what's your appetite for that as well, and your budget, right? Because these things are not cheap, and these things take a lot of time, and it's going to delay your process. It's going to slow down your development and so on. So it's a matter of like balancing. But at the end of the day, I think what they're trying to achieve is not to make our life harder in building these products, is to make ultimately our life more secure, because the responsibility is ours now, right? You cannot go and let me ship something fast to you and has like a lot of critical vulnerabilities into it. I think that's the part that, that word needs to, that kind of mindset needs to be dead right now. And for us to focus on how we can actually have that clear mindset of, I need to build something that's secure, and then it's going to solve your problem.
All right, thanks, George. That's really clear, actually, with the security and resilience repetition within the document. But following back on something you mentioned earlier with the various sectors and the diversity between them and the various verticals, that inherently means that the regulations for them are going to be different. So where's the line drawn where we can have an overarching, guideline as to what qualifies for these critical infrastructure facilities when they're so inherently different? Where do we start if we want to provide a solution as maybe a private sector developer into knowing exactly where to go? Do we have to isolate every single environment and every single situation, or are there more general starting points that we can begin with?
So I think at the beginning, it's something like this, right? These are more directions where we can head with the regulations, let's say, or the guidelines, if you want. There's going to be that private-public collaboration on defining what needs to be done. Now, there are a couple of things in the cybersecurity strategy act where it's mentioning, okay, you need to follow NIST guidelines for a secure development lifecycle, which is fine, right? Then that will be a starting point if you want, right? There are a lot of guidelines out there from OWASP and so on, right? But at the end of the day, it's what that actually applies to you, and then who your target audience is. This cybersecurity strategy plan is mostly focused on US government and the industries they control and regulate, right? Like, for instance, even though some of hospitals are state-owned, they still cannot regulate hospitals, right? So then you're going to have a different kind of enforcement, if any, for those kind of environments, right? There are a lot of nuclear power plants that are privately owned, but they are regulated. So then it's going to be a little bit of differentiation between how you can actually enforce these things. Now, back to your point as well, since these environments are so diverse, there will be different regulation, different enforcements for them. But some of these things are already happening in certain verticals. So there's nothing new, let's say, when it comes to, hey, we're trying to create a brand new, I don't know, way of doing things. No, some of these already happen in certain industries, but they're trying to align them, right? So there are industries, there are verticals in that 16 verticals I was talking about from CISA. They have some highly, highly regulated environment, how you can bring data in, right? From like nuclear facilities to, I don't know, defense and so on, cross-domain solutions and so on, keep them air gap their diodes, a lot of filtering process and so on. So from that perspective, there's already measures in place. Now, it will be ridiculous to go and say, hey, you're a, I don't know, state and local, you have a budget of $1 million a year, you're going to go and have to buy cross-domain solutions, it's going to cost you $10 million. That's not going to happen, right? So it needs to be a distinction on the sensitivity. You need to go and classify what kind of data you're handling, what is the PI information you're holding, and based on that, what's the risk associated with that, and actually how you're going to deliver, how you're going to secure that, right? And now it actually falls back to the application security of the products you're using to maintain, to mine that data, or to, I don't know, show it, display it, share it, and so on and so forth, right? Because at the end of the day, for me, it's like, let's say, it's common for any enterprise product to have like Active Directory, LDAP, and so integrations, right? The fact I have access to all your users and you're gonna trust me blindly, I'm gonna go and deploy my product and I can do whatever I want with that data. You're gonna put your credentials in and so on, and I can actually see those ones and report them back if I want to, right?
Yeah, that's one of the pillars of
huge
the security by design is minimum access. People shouldn't have those master accounts that they can use to get to anything.
Right, but right now that's actually enforced by what? It's pretty much based on trust, right?
It's
I'm building,
trust. Yeah.
right. I'm building a product, you're buying that product, that's a black box for you. And you're enjoying
Right.
the nice UI, I can do whatever I want behind the scene. And that's literally what how SolarGate happened, right? Like,
Yeah, and that's
Makes
that's why
sense.
we really refer
Yeah.
to security by design as a philosophy more than anything else.
Yeah, but George, we all understand that security by design and trust and all of these factors. Now the question, the policy is here. Like policy is here. It's been live. We need to follow. Everybody needs to follow. The what, in your opinion, what sort of challenges or the hurdles the critical infrastructure industry or organizations are facing or will be facing while implementing this, policy?
I think it's a matter of like how ready they are to implement it, right? So getting back to the SBOM example, so that was the executive order in 2021 for them to go and audit every product they have in their portfolio and to go and collect all the information on like what tools they're using, what third parties those tools are using, critical vulnerabilities and so on, for them to be able to like avoid having another SolarGate. Right now, depending on the maturity, I keep going back to that one, right? Because this applies to a lot of different organizations, being from like, I don't know, 500,000 employees to like 5 employees, right? And this is again, state, local, federal, I don't know, banking and so on. Technology can apply to everything, right? Now that they're trying to enforce it a little more global. But before, even for the state and local one, it was very hard for them to achieve that one. So now we're going to try to take one step further from that. I think it's going to be a challenge in having the resources to go and implement all that, especially in like small organizations. I expect the more mature ones already have that in place. And for them to aggregate in a centralized repository and mine that one and respond faster to that one, right? Now, there are certain things that are already happening behind the scene, but I think certain verticals, think about, I know, water and wastewater, even energy, nuclear, and so on. Those are not highly skilled, I know, IT and developer peoples in those environments, right? They're more on the OT focus, that it's not their focus to go and collect and manage all these things and so on. So then it's going to be a challenge when it comes to like resourcing as well. Budget wise, they need to buy new tools, they need to maintain that and so on. So I think this is going to be a longer effort for sure, but it's going to be also rolled out in time depending on the maturity of the organization. And the more mature, probably the more risk as well.
All right. We have a customer audience question here relevant to what you were just referring to as far as the new regulations. The question is, what kind of new regulations are we expecting to see from the outcome of this national cybersecurity strategy? So you mentioned some, some aspects of what it's going to take for the critical infrastructure, but let's broaden the question. What kind of regulations are we going to see from the government side and from the private sector? We mentioned shared responsibility. How is this going to manifest itself?
I think it's gonna be either like some I don't remember the name. Sorry. The environmental agency responded a couple of days after the Biden-Harris national security, cybersecurity plan, and or strategy, and they started putting together a guideline, right? And that is more or less, let's say, aligned to what happened in Florida. I want to say like a year or 2 years ago. I don't even remember right now, when someone was able to like control the water there, and if they want, they can even poison the water and so on, right? So it's a matter of like this is like, again, life-threatening acts, and each of these agencies, each of these controlling bodies are going to go and impose their own enforcements, because that's the way our government works, at least, right? Now there will be more potentially executive orders down the line and so on, but at the end of the day, all of them need to go and implement it at their own level, right? And that will be a little bit of distinction on who's implementing and to what level. But I think what they define as a guideline so far, it's pretty robust on what needs to be delivered, right? Some organization might do other more, I don't know, extra things to that and so on, but it's not one size fits all. And I think that's the part that makes it so generic, right? If you're looking, and I kind of like made a joke on, like, when you're looking at the OT strategy in that plan, was pretty much like, we'll have to figure out what that strategy is, and we're gonna get back to you, right? Like that's
I felt like a lot of it was that.
right, because at the end of the day, it's very hard. I think the entire message here is like, we need to take this seriously, right?
Mhm.
This cannot be just like a side job anymore, and this needs to be kind of like someone is doing, checking some box and so on. This needs to be taken as like a life-threatening potential breach, right? This is not the, I know, James Bond world anymore. This is cyber espionage. This is I know, data leakage from, you're seeing, from banks and so on. Our way of life is threatened by
Yeah.
cybersecurity, and we need to act on that. And I think that's the clear message from there.
And I think, George, you were referring to that cyber attack where a hacker tried to poison the water supply for this, Florida, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it happened in 2021, by the way.
So I'm not that far off yet.
Not that far off. Yeah. I mean, do you think the private sector is ready to take on this additional responsibility that's mentioned in this cybersecurity strategy? Applications have been developed a certain way for so long now, and I'm sure that there's many vendors and services that this is going to be kind of a new thing for. All of a sudden, they have these new regulations. How much whiplash is this going to bring to the software development community as a whole?
I think this might affect a little bit more of the startup world, or like the small innovative companies, than actually the more mature ones, right? So when you're looking at any mature vendor that actually had business with the government, or any of the 16 verticals for that matter, they have, I know, liability terms in their contract. There are master agreements and so on, when there is some kind of language, right? There's a cyber insurance and so on. Some of them were, I know, praising, or were claiming on in their ads and so on, that if you get breached, we'll pay you $1 million and so on and so forth, right? And that worked. Now, at the end of the day, I think it's very important for us to figure out what would that mean for smaller organizations than the, I know, 500 people and above, or someone that actually has been on the market and has, I don't know, let's say 50 or 100 million in revenue, right? Like for the smaller ones, I think this is going to be a potential risk, right? So it's going to be very hard for them to go and sell to these verticals anymore. And I expect, to be honest, this is not going to be just for the critical infrastructure, because at the end of the day, the US government rolls out some guidelines, more industries will follow, more countries will follow. And this happens a lot in NATO allied countries as well. It doesn't have to be just within US, right? So then we're talking about like a lot more industries, a lot more countries starting to follow similar guidelines, or even worse, making their own variation of those guidelines. So it's going to make it even more difficult to sell into those organizations. And that's going to be a little bit of a problem when you're early on and you're trying to start making a business, and for you to like have a repeatable process, right? Because this is going to delay your time to market if you need to go through extra hoops and to spend extra monies to be able to go through those extra hoops.
We got a couple questions here from the audience. First, I want to ask one that's relevant to the topic we were just discussing when you were referring to these small businesses having a harder time getting ready for this. The question is, if I have an application and I'm a startup, where do I start? Where and how do I start to ensure the application of my product, to ensure application security to my product to service these industries, these sectors?
So there are different kind of guidelines. Again, there's NIST, there's OWASP, and so on. There are tools, and these are more like open source, if you want, or like things that you can go and like public document, you can follow those guidelines. There are different commercial products that are going to try to enforce more things. But at the end of the day, what is required more and more is an end-to-end security solution, right? So we're not talking just about like, hey, deploy a static code analysis solution, a SaaS product, deploy, or like in your development lifecycle, add also software composition analysis, an SBOM product, and you're ticking the boxes. You have a security development lifecycle. You can actually go and get your, comply with some of the certifications, and you're good, right? There's a lot more that needs to be done, right? There's security trainings that need to be done, part of that one, for your developers as well, for your engineers. You cannot say, I have like one application security guy that's going to go and do all the tests and make sure everything is fine, and he's signing off for every release, therefore he's responsible, right? I don't think that's the way of doing things, right? So it's a matter of like, again, back to the maturity. If you're a 5-people company, I don't think you have a chance. Probably all 5 of you are going to go and go through that one and figure out what you have to do, right? And the more interesting part is that whatever is defined by the industry as a guideline, this is how you need to, let's say, password on what's your password policy, how many characters, what kind of characters, and so on and so forth. You're going to see that it's a very different world from what OWASP is saying is the guideline recommendation versus what the enterprise is telling you. Nope, I need to comply with this and this and this. Otherwise, this is a blocker for us, right? What's like, rotating keys and so on, what's actually in the guidelines versus what's in the real life, right? This is going to complicate your life a little bit. The more you're going for different environments, some of them actually have their own policies. Getting back to the part where like they're using the guidelines, the way they enforce it might be slightly different. Welcome to the enterprise world.
Yeah, so that's a good segue actually into the next customer question, which we talked a lot about the application security, sounds like, from the IT side. So the question is, are there differences between IT risks and OT risks? And how do you secure these critical infrastructure applications? Probably referring to the low-level OT environments. And are there different standards? So the question is, what standards do you recommend? And to add to that, are there different standards and different focuses in application security in OT environments as there would be from a surrounding IT environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a way more diverse world in OT, let's say, right? Like in an IT environment, I'll oversimplify it, so please don't quote me on that. But let's say you're mostly focusing on the web and email traffic, let's say, right? There is a lot more. Again, most applications are talking REST APIs right now over HTTP and so on. So that is kind of like it's a more simplified world. When you're going to the OT environment, well, each vendor has its own protocol, almost with their own way of communicating what they're trying to do, how they're trying to do, and so on. And securing that I think becomes to a whole different level of complexity on like what you're trying to achieve and what you actually have in that environment. Now, for me, the OT part, it is literally life-threatening. And I'll give another example so Irfan can actually go and Google when that happened, because again, I think it was 2020. But there was a case actually when I think it was through a phishing attack, a ransomware attack, like was able to pretty much shut down one hospital in Germany. And there was a patient that was literally on her way to the hospital, and she had to be rerouted to a different hospital. It was like 2 hours away, and she died on her way there, right? So that's I don't know, I
Life-threatening,
cannot
yeah.
even explain. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
So that is not something you can play with, right? Like that's something that it's affecting a lot of people. So when you're looking at like how we can actually secure those environments, where there's very diverse world, like I said, right? Like you have still fight jets that are updating through floppy disks, right? And versus, I know you have state-of-the-art brand new nuclear facility that was built a couple of years ago versus the one was built in the 60s, right? Some of them need to go through like a refresh cycle and so on, technology speaking, sorry, but it's a matter of like when that happens and so on. So I think it's easier in the IT world, maybe because that gets a lot more attention in the press and so on, right? To go and update certain things or refresh the hardware and so on. It's not as easy to go and refresh the hardware in the OT world, because you might, like in the IT, I'm going to go and swap a server with the latest version. Okay, it's going to cost you probably potentially even hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? But in the OT world, to go, I'm going to swap this Windows 98 second edition machine with a brand state-of-the-art Windows 11, but I need to swap also the centrifuge that's going to cost me $50 million, right? So that's where you need to balance a little bit better. And maybe this will be actually a good idea to have Pete on an OT focused topic as well, to have a conversation on standards and so on there, because I think this is a huge and fascinating story as well to tell.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're planning on having him on one of these future webinars as well.
It was my idea.
Oh, got it. We'll give you all the credit, George. Yeah.
Yeah, you are the one.
So touching on that OT versus IT topic, going back on something that happened relatively recently in May of 2021, that ransomware attack took out the Colonial Pipeline, which prevented nearly half of the supply to the East Coast of gas and jet fuel. And I think it lasted a couple weeks or 10 days before the issue was resolved. And according to official report, there was a exposed VPN password. And that's all it took for the hackers to get into the system and steal several gigabytes of data and put it on ransom for the industry. Now, this was all the IT surrounding environment, but this directly shut down the actual physical OT systems, the pumps that are pushing the gasoline through the Colonial Pipeline. Now, we're seeing this a lot where the OT systems might be reporting data to cloud. They might be, doing other bypasses of the traditional Purdue model layering. So, does this imply that we need to secure and monitor external IT assets with the same scrutiny as we would for the internal critical OT systems, things that are air gapped? Because they seem to be blending together.
Yeah, sorry, I'm laughing and I don't remember now. Again, homework for our Irfan to like Google search that one. There was this
Nate did that,
report.
Yeah.
He did that.
There was this report from, I think, DHS or like from CISA from DHS years ago, where they found out something along the lines that for every air gap, or like in average, an air gapped environment has 7 connections to the outside world. Right?
Yeah.
So that kind of like perceives the purpose, right? Like, yeah, the entire idea for me is like this, right? Even though people are trying to keep them separate, they're usually not, right? And this is getting back to, and I think this is actually part of the strategy and the executive order from 2 years ago. We need to go out of this let's say, old mindset that we have a moat around the castle and everyone is secure in the castle, right? And we need to have like a more forward-facing collaboration, more, I don't know, cyber threat sharing, I know, even like cloud solutions that are actually able to secure and monitor these environments. Now, the fact people,
Yeah,
you like it or not,
a castle without 7 drawbridges.
yeah, exactly. Or like they're always on, or like
Yeah.
open. But back to this one, I do think that is important at the end of the day to understand that that convergence is happening, right? It's no longer like, hey, I'm a power plant, or let's say, because this happens quite often in the US, right? People are operating nuclear facilities. They have also like hydro plants and so on. And there's a huge corporation behind them owning, let's say, like 10, 15 of them, right? It's not like, hey, the IT of the HQ, it's secure, or even on the power plant, there's the IT versus the OT. And those are total separate teams. They're managing their own budgets and they have no relationship whatsoever to another. This convergence, like I said, it's happening. They need to start working together, and for them to understand be better what's going on, because keeping them apart, it's great from, let's say, budget perspective and manageability from the higher ups and so on, visibility, like how much it costs you to operate those ones and so on, not necessarily from operability on like what actually, how fast you can respond to incidents and so on, because that VPN most probably was not supposed to be there in the first place. I was there just because someone had, especially now in these times with COVID and so on, they had to work from home, and that was the easiest way for them to go and remote in to take care of something, right?
Right.
George, although you have explained that how to avoid such attacks, but I see a question related to this, or maybe you want to emphasize on the certain areas where if we adopt these strategies to avoid these sort of attacks. So someone asked that how could we have avoided that, like this attack?
Well, so any VPN, like the fact you're able to steal credentials, this is not just the only attack, right? There was the same supply chain attack, let's call it, and so on, went Okta through a third party that's offering support. They had limited access to the data and so on, but Okta is one of the most important identity providers out there, right? But for every VPN, there's MFA that should be in place, right? That you're able to get breached one way or another. Needs to be containment. Who's having access to what, for how far they can go, and so on, right? Like at the end of the day, no one that actually has VPN access should have on its own ability to go and shut down the colonial pipeline, right?
Right.
And this actually goes to like getting back to the discussion we had at the beginning of the call, where for enterprises, config management is so important to go through approval process to do that. And someone with a VPN credential can go and shut down the entire pipeline. I don't think that's the best process in place possible.
Right. It just goes to show that you have to follow the strict guidelines. You have to follow the minimum access policies that are made for those critical systems, and make sure that those policies are being followed all the way up, even to something like remoting in from a device. And it does. It matters, because if you can bypass all these other defenses, then the entire point's moot. It has to be a beginning to end full philosophy on how your environment works, and that really is security by design as a concept.
I think that this again oversimplifying it, right? Like the way I look at cybersecurity is fear driven, but the moment cybersecurity gets in the way, you're trying to find ways to bypass it. Sorry. And this is valid for everyone. It doesn't have to be, and this is what hurts us the most, right? Like if you're working in security, you'll see that a lot. I'm sorry for cybersecurity engineers out there, for you guys are managing environments where I probably see that a lot, right? Like, I cannot send this bloody email because something is getting flagged, or I cannot do my work because I don't know the AV is scanning right now, or something like that, right?
It can be
And then-
loveless. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So you're always getting blamed for something. But at the end of the day, this is the part that actually is important, right? That VPN was there and bypassed probably the security enforcements, right? And that's the part where security was built not to make your life easier, but to make it more secure, right? And I think that's the part that people, I think, are trying to find ways to respond faster to things, which maybe an exception based it's accepted, but they never roll back from that or not, right? So you need to figure out ways where security can seamlessly be, I don't know, either enforced or at least involved in the application development cycle, in your operation layer, and so on, right? And that's what made certain vendors so successful, because they were actually sitting besides your operational layer or besides your IT infrastructure and so on, not necessarily blocking the way you're doing your job and so on, but trying to prevent these attacks. They're trying to prevent or even block before you know that those things even exist and so on, right? So that will make a lot more transparent for you as an end user what actually happens behind the scene.
Thanks, George. I want to shift gears here a little bit and talk some specifics about the techniques that you use and the products that you help develop here at OpSWAT. Could we pull up the file upload overview diagram, please? For a file upload use case with application security, how do we describe the flow and the process from beginning to end? What are we really trying to achieve with application security in a file upload use case and scenario?
Sure. One thing to make everyone to get on the same page, right? So the way we kind of use application security as a term at OpSWAT, there's application security as a market as well, application security as a sub-market, if you want, right? And then within that one, I think Gartner calls it like web application and API protection. That's the magic quadrant. That's where this file upload security piece is falling into. Now, what's important for us is, and this is the part we have a lot of success when it comes to three main verticals, but everything in critical infrastructure verticals are relevant. The three main ones are by far government, banking, BFSI, banking, financial service, and insurance, and technology. Is everyone nowadays is a software building company, right? There's no more the idea of a bank that's brick and mortar, right? I do most of my banking from my phone. I don't even have to go to a web interface on my laptop anymore, right? And you like it or not, banks are application developers, right? And there's I'll give banks an example. Same thing will apply for government with, I know, submitting your insurance, not insurance, sorry, your taxes. Unfortunately, with these days with COVID and so on, was unemployment and so on and so forth. But getting back to banks, they have know your customer as a requirement. Even when you're opening an account, they might ask you for a utility bill, a picture of your ID, and so on. You can do all that through your phone, right? The entire flow here is quite simple. People are uploading from an untrusted source, and that's the internet, right? Coming from the outside. Before those files land into your backend, you want to filter those files. And filtering can mean multiple things, right? Filtering can mean scan for antivirus. Filtering can mean removing bad objects that might be malicious, right? If your application is let's say, we're OpSWAT, we're trying to hire more people. We have our careers portal. By the way, guys, check it out. Hint, hint. But when you're submitting a resume, I wouldn't expect for you to put a JavaScript in your PDF resume. I wouldn't expect for you to have a macro in your resume, for instance, right? If I'm an insurance company, I don't expect in reports they're submitting at the end of the month, maybe as a broker, to have embedded objects that are so on.
Yeah, let's pull up the CDR document image actually, because that's relevant to the macro.
And by the way,
I'm all over the place.
Yeah, no, it's okay. We can follow
and by
along.
the way, we have a relevant question by Ronald. If you can see that, it's about since we are talking about the application security and it's play a critical role in protecting the critical infrastructure. So does OpSWAT offers or works or provide any solution either based on AI or to basically fix or mitigate this problem?
Okay, so application security probably for far too long was heavily focused on vulnerabilities, right? I'm using this list of third-party libraries. right? And originally that was built at SBOM and SCA was built mostly for like licensing enforcement to make sure you're using a compliant license within your product. So you're not going to have, you're not going to make your product open source. But then it became, hey, these third-party tools have vulnerabilities, critical vulnerabilities, how you can mitigate that one and so on. Now, there are a lot of options out there where that's going to help you prioritizing the vulnerabilities and vulnerability management. And I think that's the important part, right? I'm a strong advocate that AI is going to help us tremendously. I think there's a lot of traction with ChatGPT these days. I'm a big fan as well, don't get me wrong. But AI is not solving cybersecurity, right? There was, years ago, it was like AV is dead, cybersecurity, or like AI is solving all this cybersecurity thing, and that one died out on its own. So AI will help prioritizing some of vulnerabilities. But at the end of the day, the question is how far you have to go in fixing those vulnerabilities for. Let's take a quick, simple example. I'm using a library for something super simple. 90% of the code in that library, it's not going to be used, right? And then if I use only 1% of the or 10% of the functionality of that library, what if the thing that I'm actually using is not exposed to that critical vulnerability, right? So there are tools that go into code and figure out, okay, is this piece of code that's vulnerable, it's actually being used by your product or not? Is that piece of code actually, or even is that library, is there a known exploit for that one, or it's still, let's say, there's no exploit document for that one and so on. So that's the level of like ranking and understanding on how to fix those ones. Most of the auto mitigation, if you want to call it, for vulnerability is like, I'm going to upgrade to the latest version of that library and see if it works, right? And I think this is something that even like GitHub is doing out of the box, and they're trying to see if they can actually they're gonna run the test for you and so on, or you can auto run the test to see if that's gonna still work or not for you. But at the end of the day, I don't think this is something that's gonna be that easily solved over the night. And I do think AI is gonna help, but again, it's gonna help in ranking and prioritizing it. It's not gonna be that much in auto mitigation. Even though with ChatGPT, I saw it's able to like generate code and so on. So that will be interesting moving forward. So I'm looking forward to that.
So do you feel the diagram on screen with the disarming the
sorry.
potential threats is more of a surefire way to protect these vulnerabilities? Is it more reliable than the IT landscape? What are we looking at here?
Sorry, yeah. To get back to diagram, so I think there are two very different things when I talk about vulnerabilities, right? There's like vulnerabilities in your code, and there are vulnerabilities that are coming as code, or like, let's say, as user input. So like, I think everyone here is aware of like OWASP top 10, for instance, injection being for far too long one of the most prevalent ones seen out there. People are aware of like code injection, SQL injection, and so on. At the end of the day, a file is a user input. The way you're sanitizing your, form input for any code injection and so on, the same way you should sanitize your files as well, right? And the vulnerabilities the way you can use actually a piece of, let's call it a piece of code if you want, to go and exploit the vulnerability of a third-party tool you're using or not, right? The same thing you can use actually a file to actually go and exploit the vulnerability in your product downstream as well, right? And kind of that happened with Equifax, and I think that was 2017, if I remember correctly. But the entire idea is very important for us to look at this one with the same level of scrutiny as we're looking for any data, any user input as well, right? There's a lot of like processes and guidelines on how you can actually go and sanitize the user input for avoiding any code injection, escaping characters, and so on and so forth. The same level of scrutiny again needs to be done on the files as well. And this is where CDR comes into play and says, hey, let's define what's the company policy, what kind of files you expect through this flow. If you're expecting only, let's say, resumes, it's going to be these 5-10 file types, and we're going to keep the content secure the way you want it. We're going to remove the embedded objects like JavaScript, all the objects, ActiveX controls, and so on that you might not need. Now, this is not going to flatten the file per se, but it's going to actually keep the same usability as long as it's actually removing, again, macros, any embedded objects that might drive a malicious behavior, right? And this is the part where it's more prevention. It's transparent for the end user. You're still going to have access to your content, but it's going to be a risk-free content than actually having all the extra things that you're probably not going to need anyway, right? Make
Got it.
sense?
Makes sense. So relating to this, George, the product that you work on here at OpSWAT, can you give us just a few minutes as we come close to the end of the hour here, what it is that you work on here at OpSWAT and what does it do for application security and these critical infrastructure environments?
Sure. I'm probably going to need like half an hour for that, but let me
You
put
got to
it
make
in
it short.
Okay, I'm kidding. So think about. I own a couple of products. Defender Core being the main one. It's the same flavor, technology speaking. The technology stack is the same for Defender Cloud as the SaaS product. There are two more for secure storage and ICAP, part of my team, ICAP server. But let's focus on Defender Core and what we can actually do for the application security world. So Defender Core is a file analysis pipeline, if you want to call it, file analysis workflow where that's actually on top of a technology stack, right? So we have different technologies that are solving different problems. One is DeepCDR that you just saw that's able to sanitize these productivity files. The second one is multi-scanning. Instead of relying on only one AV to scan your file, we're OEMing a suite of over 30 different AVs, and we'll process all the files in parallel to crowdsource that intelligence to offer the best detection possible. We have Proactive DLP, and that's more of like a secrets and keywords and pattern matching, and also sensitive information, PII, and so on, credit card numbers, social security numbers, you name it, and so on. Right. Then we have vulnerability, file-based vulnerability assessment, getting back to identifying vulnerabilities in firmware, in Docker containers, and so on and so forth. Right. We also have two more technologies, threat intelligence, to augment on what we know about this file as that file is going through our pipeline, and also Sandbox that's actually detonating that dynamic analysis to enrich your analysis if something is getting flagged. So as a file flows in, depending on the file type, we're going to apply different technologies to respond to that one, right? If it's a productivity document, DeepCDR, Proactive DLP needs to be there. If it's actually an executable, a firmware upgrade, Proactive DLP is not going to identify anything there, right? Because it's a binary, but actually vulnerability is actually going to kick in and say, hey, this actually have this critical vulnerability, and it's going to allow an attacker to have remote code execution access to your systems. Maybe you shouldn't deploy it, right? So in a nutshell, we're trying to provide an end-to-end solution, different angles of looking at the file to provide the best assessment of that file and how to use it or not. Now, this can be used in different flows, file upload being one of them. We have a use case that's more like, let's say, DevSecOps focused on like, as I bring libraries in, as I bring actually, containers in and so on to use as part of my application, I want to do a validation process to see what's in there. As I roll out, as I publish containers and artifacts to the outside world, I want to make sure there's no secrets in that container, right? AWS secrets were very popular at some point on GitHub, and crypto miners love that one, right? And the same thing applies again. You don't want to have critical vulnerabilities. You don't want to have malware. Right now, there's a huge uplift in people actually putting even crypto miner password sniffing and so on in the libraries that are put on GitHub, that are on NPM, PyPy, and so on, right? And that actually, and this is the interesting part, usually the program in these companies is like vulnerability management for the application you're building, not actually malware detection for the applications you're building. Because the mindset is still all this vulnerability is going to bring in is potential vulnerabilities, not necessarily going to deliver also malware. And that's the part that right now, at least for us, gets a lot of traction. We're able to go and make sure there's a validation process before you actually consume this external. Again, it's user input, someone that can be in any parts of the world. You can have no control on who's actually building that one and what they actually write in those 50,000 lines of code. You're going to bring it as part of your organization as your part of application.
Right. Thanks, George. I'm impressed you were able to get all that in about 5 minutes. We're right here at the end of our webinar. And if we didn't get to any of your questions in the chat, we'll be following up with email. Sorry if we didn't get to those. Thank you, George, for your time. And thank you for providing your insight here. For those of you that have not yet done it, please head over to opswatacademy.com and register. Check out our courses. We have many topics on related subject of this webinar, such as the file upload processes, multi-scanning, CDR, and vulnerability assessment as well. Look forward to new webinars coming out from the OPSO Academy team. You'll see those on our LinkedIn posting and also in social media. Our next webinar is threat hunting and malware analysis. So look forward to that. We're really excited to have the new guest speakers on. Thanks again, George. We hope to have you again on soon so you can share more insights on another area of expertise.
Thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it. See you
All
soon.
right. Thank you.